and welcome to our first webinar of 2016. Today's webinar is on a very important topic that some of you may have to deal with in your own positions, and that is onboarding and offboarding employees. In a previous company that I had helped found, Still Secure, we did a lot of work, for instance, for the U.S. Department of Defense, and it was very important that we had some policies and processes in place that when people left their employment at our company, that these policies and processes were followed to ensure that sensitive data or access was not available at the proper time. So this is an important subject, and every company has to deal with it, whether it be onboarding, offboarding, and both. So I think it's going to be a good one and a good way to kick off our new year. So our presenter today, and if we can go to the second screen, is Greg Keller, a friend of mine who's also Chief Product Officer at JumpCloud. And actually, JumpCloud has done a nice little ebook on this, and Greg can tell you more about it as well. We'll try to get everyone here a copy, I believe. But Greg is going to talk to us about some of the things you need to be cognizant of and some suggestions to a orderly and secure way of onboarding and offboarding employees. So without further ado, let me introduce Greg. Greg, are you there?
I am here. Thanks, Alan.
All right, we're off to a good start. You're there. All right, Greg, go right. We jump in.
And I am jumping. So first and foremost, folks, happy 2016. I hope everyone had a phenomenal, restful, and a wonderful holiday season. And just like you, we here at JumpCloud are getting back to work and really focusing on the problems related to security and identity management. But this presentation was, when I was asked to do this, I basically raised my hand very quickly because it struck a couple personal notes that we'll kind of walk through. Number one, while I am a Chief Product Officer here at JumpCloud, I have been able and fortunate to help build a few companies, some startup companies, and in various roles, most notably operations, Chief Operating Officer, and the job quite literally was to, hire, engage, onboard, and eventually, in certain cases, offboard employees. And I know the pain, and I know what can go wrong and what needs to go right in many, many circumstances. So I was looking forward to being able to sort of tell some tales here. In addition, we now, over the last 2.5 years in sort of getting our directory as a service product in market, are exposed to quite literally, a myriad of various sort of pristine environments we've seen of our customers, onboard and offboard employees, as well as the opposite, which is sort of those companies that are really looking for a game plan. So with this said, this presentation is really a set of considerations, things to be, as Alan said, cognizant of in both those scenarios of bringing on and engaging a new employee, as well as the time when you need to say goodbye to your current employee. You will receive an ebook after this. Our marketing team will be distributing to you your own copy of this, which goes into much deeper levels of detail and considerations for what to input into a checklist, as an example. So just note that after the presentation, you'll get all the details in the ebook. So let's dive in. We're going to walk through the following. Total time we should be, with surveys and questions, probably out of here in about 35-40 minutes, so we'll be extremely efficient today. We'll talk about what it's like when you have to say goodbye to someone. We'll then go into the set of considerations you need for onboarding, the same for offboarding. We'll talk at the end a little bit about the quest that the companies we see and engage with every day across verticals, older companies as well as sort of modern cloud-forward companies. They're all looking for ways to centralize an identity of an employee. So we'll talk about that. And finally, the ebook we'll discuss. In the middle of this will be a survey Alan will do just to get some sort of data from you about your challenges, but we'll get there in just a few minutes. So let's talk about this scenario. So the phone, you're an IT person, the phone rings, you're out at lunch with your friends, and it's someone in your HR group. Hey, Greg, John, you know your guy in engineering, he was let go. Do you know if we blocked his access to GitHub? Those are the alarming questions that you don't want to have asked, and there needs to be a plan in place for when an employee is offboarded, and we'll get there in a moment, but that there are no holes, and this is always the scramble. So as an operator of a former company in a variety of startups in the past, you do what you can, right? You're a small company, you don't necessarily have all the capital to build to buy and or implement all these elaborate security systems. You do what you can. You know, in my case, I literally would buy bulks of MacBook Pros off of Amazon. I would have them shipped to me. I would literally create all of the local accounts on the box for the new employee. I'd create their Gmail accounts. When they came on board, I'd walk them through the HR stuff. I'd make sure that they knew the corporate, Wi-Fi, SSID, and password, which, guess what? All the other employees were using and sharing. And then the employee has to go a few months later, a year later, for whatever reason. You fired him, or she needs to go get a new job or backpack or whatever. But guess what? You're left with instant silos of that employee's identity just sort of strewn about your infrastructure. So we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail in the offboarding section. But ultimately, it is about a game plan. It is about process and assembling one and adhering to it and communicating it. These are all extremely important parts of the process, which the ebook will get into. The inverse of this is onboarding, as we'll get into in a second, but it's about creating an environment, a welcoming environment for your employee. And in fact, let's start to talk about that in a second, but let me first just leave you with a quote that I want in all of your heads. Folks, paranoia is not retroactive. A good friend of mine, and who just happens to be our chief technology officer here, Topher Marie at JumpCloud, really put this in my head years ago. And it is a posture that security people have and should maintain. You can't suddenly become scared once a bad thing happens. You have to be prepared for it. Be paranoid, unfortunately, but that helps you yield good process to adhere to. So paranoia, folks, is not retroactive. You have to keep it moving forward and keep a good plan in place. So now let's dive into onboarding, and let's talk through some considerations IT professionals in particular need when considering a new employee coming on board. Incidentally, just as sort of a preface, there's so much involved with onboarding that, from HR needs to, again, IT needs, which is what we're going to concentrate on. Ultimately, it is about creating an environment for your employee it shows that you have your game down, and it gives this new employee confidence that, wow, I just joined the right company. It creates a good environment, but mostly that they are instantaneously productive. They're not waiting for things. They're not waiting for access. These things just happen, and it's efficient. So let's dive into the IT considerations. We'll kind of walk through, from an IT perspective, the sort of core elements of where an employee's identity needs to sort of be allowed access to. Again, this is not exhaustive, but it'll start to give you a mental, if not written, or some other process checklist in order to create an efficient onboarding. So let's walk through these. The first is a directory service. Now, again, as a startup guy in prior lives, some of the companies that I helped build, we didn't have the capital to acquire an Active Directory, or frankly, have the expertise to stand up an LDAP server in some cases. So if you can afford it and you can provide the IT resource to manage these types of pieces of infrastructure. Traditional directories like Active Directory for employee-facing needs are phenomenal. Now again, we'll sort of talk through some details of directories in a few minutes, but again, traditional directories, which are most often, if not exclusively, managed on-premise by your own sort of IT resources, your own actual people who know AD and can manage it. There are some sort of managed service providers who can do this for you, but you're talking about the core of your network, which is the place where your identities are stored and managed. So in this case, a directory service like AD is really a strong consideration, but it can be problematic when you have off-prem and or remote employees. This is stuff to consider. You'll have to be very savvy with VPNs. You have to ensure that the machines that are out in the field can be properly managed. And frankly, in the case of Active Directory, it's extremely Windows-centric. Yes, you can integrate with other endpoints like Macs, certainly not out of box or not without some pain. So just be advised. It is good to start with a strong directory, a central place to manage the identities, but just be advised that there are some issues, especially when it relates to non-Windows devices and or cloud computing infrastructure. There's another aspect to this too, which is multiple directories. AD can provide a lot of support for, let's call it employee-facing infrastructure and resources. The Windows box, you give the employee their laptop, as an example, some Wi-Fi because it offers some radio services, file directories and file shares. All that is good with an Active Directory. But what about Linux infrastructure? Meaning you have let's say you're a SaaS company and you have a big product that you're hosting in Amazon. Guess what? It's going to be extremely complicated to have an employee who's a developer have that account propagated and managed and provisioned on 1,000 Linux servers, up on Amazon. So you need to then think, well, I guess we're going to have to go down the LDAP path as well, meaning you have an immediate sort of bifurcation between the identity, some employee-facing, some technical-facing and product-facing. So just be advised, you need to sort of think through these decisions. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, directories as a service can mitigate many of in fact, all of those problems, especially for cloud-facing infrastructure. So let's move a little bit deeper. The employee, once they are centralized, hopefully in a solid directory, will need to communicate. So of course, there's plenty of email options. You all use one of the following on this webinar, I'm sure. You're either using Gmail, Office 365 / Exchange for those that are still managing an on-prem Exchange / Outlook server. Some now are using Zoho Mail, which is sort of like a competitor to Gmail, but invariably you have a strong email communication vehicle in place, and that's great. The identity will need to be provisioned to those applications. So considerations need to be made on how you're going to instantiate an identity from your Active Directory to Gmail. There are software products you can use to do that, but it's often, again, pretty problematic. So just be advised, how are you going to onboard the identity into those critical communication vehicles like Gmail or Office 365. O365 obviously is part and parcel with Active Directory. Microsoft by design makes that easy. But if you have a hybrid environment, Gmail and AD or Gmail and LDAP for that matter, a little bit, if not a lot different to make that sort of work cohesively. You also need to, when you're provisioning these identities, if you're not doing sort of anything sophisticated, a piece of guidance, and I raise my hand, I've done this, is to get away from what I call the yellow sticky phenomenon, which is, oh, Johnny just got his, we just onboarded him, I just created his new Gmail account, I'm going to walk his username and his password over to him on a yellow sticky so that he can sort of log in. That's just bad form, bad security posture. It's easy, but you got to get away from the easy button here. In this case, the easy button is the secure button, which is get the employee's personal email if necessary. Utilize the email system's email invitation system, which is by its design a mechanism to fire off an email to the individual, to their endpoint, to their personal email client in some cases, enables them to click through on a tokenized sort of invitation for a time period, a secure time period, where then they set their own credentials. Extremely important. No one but that employee should know that set of credentials. Again, always thinking security. Paranoia is not retroactive. I'll be repeating that throughout the course of this. The last reason for that, as I've witnessed, is the yellow sticky is handed to the employee. The yellow sticky then remains on the employee's monitor where it can be seen, and or they never change the password that you sort of set for them. They just say, I'll just use that. I'm not very creative. I'll just use that moving forward. So get away from the yellow sticky phenomenon, especially as it relates to email services. Now let's move into the world of device provisioning. Now, the word device is myriad, meaning it's most often construed with the thing that you hold in your hand, like your iPhone or your Android device or your Windows smartphone. But in our world, it sort of relates to any end-user computing device, a server, a MacBook, a Windows desktop, or, of course, your phone. And there's a huge amount of debate here, which I'm not going to sort of hit the hornet's nest here, as it relates to BYOD, bring your own device. That's another larger topic we'll maybe handle in another webinar someday, but it's an interesting one because who really owns the device, and does the employer really have control over accessing and sort of owning the data that is existing on that personally owned device? And yes, of course, there are a number of pieces of software now that are sort of riding the BYOD wave. Many of them sort of are referred to as sandbox environments where it's your machine, but your employer owns the sandbox and they can do what they will with it, and that's good. But it's often clunky or invasive, or it's hard to manage, especially in remote situations. In any event, just be advised, think through all of these things. What is it like for your organization to really entertain a BYOD policy, and what does it mean for the company-owned data that lives on that box? If you are provisioning machines, clearly, and I started this presentation off by saying I bought all my Amazon or MacBook Pros off Amazon and would create accounts, but the violation I made was when I onboarded the employee, I was lazy. And what I mean is I would put the account on the MacBook, in our case, could be a Windows machine, but in this case we were all Mac. And I would create the employee's user account on the machine, and the laziness factor was, man, I don't want to necessarily have this guy come to me every time he needs software installed, so I'm going to make him an administrator. And I guarantee you many people on this call fall into that trap, and there are legitimate reasons to make folks administrators on their devices. In fact, many developers have to be because of the amount of software they have to sort of install in their own environments. But just be advised that is not always a good practice. You need to question the employee and their role and determine if they really need to be an administrator on that box. The other thing is to ensure you have a backdoor administrative account. Just don't rely on handing them the machine and give them the account. Then they change the password and they hand you back the machine and you can't get in. You need a good process to build in an administrative service account and ensure that you have an encrypted password so that you can get into that machine and control it at any time. At a minimum, if the machine is in your hand. At a maximum, you need to think about considerations of software that can be installed on this machine to remotely control and manage the machine, up to and including machine wipes in the case of truly rogue employees. So just be advised, question the employee, not directly, but who they are, what their role is, and make sure their manager either gives you an affirmation that they have to be an admin. If not, their normal local user account on that machine. Similarly, let's talk about a special version of those those computing devices, servers and other pieces of infrastructure. So in the sort of cloud-forward world, many of you, I'm sure, are either currently all cloud-based or you're moving bits and pieces of your infrastructure to the cloud. The cloud, in this case, to be very specific, it means a lot, but in this case, I'm talking about infrastructure as a service. Cloud computing providers like AWS or Google Compute Engine or SoftLayer or Rackspace, anything that you have done to move your server farms off-prem and into a hosted environment like those is what I'm speaking about. And as this has occurred, these machines, especially ephemeral and rapidly elasticized infrastructure, meaning machines, Linux primarily, that can spin up basically at the bequest of the application itself, is making the concept of security extremely hard unless you have a good programmatic way to instantiate accounts on those newly invoked systems, those new servers, but more importantly, ways to control them. As mentioned very early in this conversation, this is often the role, very specialized, of LDAP and privileged account management. And most often what I've witnessed, at least on the customer sites that I've gone into, is a bifurcation between the corporate directory that's managing all the employee sort of resources, like the individual machines, if it's Windows, or file shares and that kind of stuff. But LDAP is carefully sort of separately managing the infrastructure on those servers. When done right, it's great. And in mature IT organizations that can sort of manage that bifurcated role of those directories. When done wrong, it's egregious, meaning if those accounts aren't wiped off of those machines, once an employee sort of has left, it could be disastrous in terms of backdoors, and God forbid these rogue employees, if departed, aren't nefarious in their sort of willingness to take down your infrastructure. And one pseudo access that was forgotten about on an employee's account on a Linux server or a farm of servers, it could be business ending. So again, paranoia is not retroactive. Do the right thing. Think about the concept of, as we'll talk about in depth on the offboarding stuff, but just be advised about that bifurcation. So let's talk about apps. So now gone are the days, and I remember them well over the last 21 years of being in software R&D and operations. Gone are the days of installing apps on machines, meaning, yeah, I can't tell you the thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars I've budgeted for in my past lives for software imaging for employees to make sure the right software is installed on the machine, and then we ship out the machine or provision the machine in some way. So gone are those days primarily. There still are small instances of you got to have a piece of software installed on your machine, but primarily SaaS is ruling the day. It's much, much simpler now. But the simplicity of getting access to these apps has created another management problem. It's in this case, it's 10s or 20s of apps per employee that they need to get access to. But again, what I've seen on onboarding is each of these SaaS apps has the employee having a unique account per SaaS app. And again, lots of potential for holes and backdoors. But the good news is strong players in the identity market, SSO providers, single sign-on providers, help to solve this problem. Just remember, the SSO provider needs to have a strong backing corporate directory to it. It could be an Active Directory, it could be a directory as a service, or in fact an LDAP. But an SSO solution is only as good as the strong corporate directory that sits behind it. So again, this is sort of, in the sense of true SSO, you need to think beyond just SaaS app authentication for the employee, but that one identity that will not only log them into their Google apps, but is probably the thing that's getting them on the Wi-Fi and probably into their machine as well. So again, cart before the horse here. We're going to talk about centralized identity management in a second, but be advised that that as well. Well, on the last topic for onboarding is Wi-Fi. So in this case, again, I am raising my hand, sheepishly here, and I bet some of you live this or have lived it. I bet you have a shared SSID and a shared password sitting on a whiteboard. And granted, in most cases, that's for the guest account. Okay, fair enough, and we have that too. But in the real world, many employees are sharing on their sort of corporate network, the non-guest network. They're all still sharing the same SSID and password that is passed around. And just like SSO that we talked about before, each employee really needs to be utilizing their own single identity to log in to the Wi-Fi endpoint or endpoints. And any strong IT person understands that this is absolutely possible. It's in fact not very complicated. Protocols like Radius, as an example, allow, or LDAP for that matter, allow great wireless access points. It could be anything from Meraki, Cisco Meraki to Palo Alto. They can look back at a corporate directory in order to use that employee's identity to sign into the endpoint. And very often it's just like, forget it. It'd be a nice to have. But guess what? John that we let go in engineering, well, we all share the same password. We now have to recycle the SSID or the password on the SSID for the endpoints, or all of them, because we let Johnny go. And how many times do you have to do that and interrupt your employees so that they re-log in with the new, better password once an employee leaves? You have to move away from that model. So with that said, what I want to do is take a pause. I'm going to loop back in Mr. Schimmel, who has some survey questions for us. And again, this is being very selfish here. I would love to hear some of these answers, or I'm looking forward to the data. But I'll let Alan kind of fire up the survey software.
Thank you, Greg. Before we jump onto the survey, I wanted to give a shout out and say hello to all attendees today who are coming from the Global Internet Startups Meetup groups from around the world. Our friends at Webinar had helped promote today's webinar to the group, and we thank you very much for attending. That being said, here's a couple of poll questions for us, and the first one is out here. And the first one is, what's the most challenging part of onboarding and offboarding for you? And you could select one of the following, as you can see. Just click on, and we'll, Jules, I assume the polls are being done. We'll close this question off in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We've got about 3/4 of the people voted. And the winner is managing remote employees. Yeah, that is a tough one.
That is cool to see, actually. I agree.
And determining where removing employees' accounts exist across. Yeah. In today's world, it's a crazy world. So that was our poll question. Here's our next one. And this we might have some insight in, Greg, based upon the questions I've been getting from our attendees. But do you use a directory to currently onboard, offboard employees? And if so, which one? And we'll give you just a few seconds here to vote. Let's wait another, only about half of you have voted. We'll go 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, votes are in. Wow, 56% no directory, 22% active, and then LDAP at 8, and directory as a service at 6, and other at 8. Very interesting.
Incredibly interesting, yeah.
Yep. And then I think that was it on our polling questions. Yes. Let's go to some questions from the audience, Greg, and I think Interestingly, first of all, I understand some of you may have a little problem with the sound, hit and miss. I apologize. I hope it's better now. But Greg, we have quite a few members who are from EU or European countries, and one of the issues, well, you're focusing on Active Directory, but in Europe, we don't see much of that stuff anymore, though poll questions still show it's the biggest one. Maybe in some large companies, but smaller companies don't use it. They're mostly LDAP based. Um, any views or suggestions on dealing with Windows end users using an LDAP directory, or does using something like a jump cloud, a directory as a service, sort of negate that issue?
So, all right, so the question, as I understand it, is the European Union sort of employee bases are primarily utilizing Windows devices. So there's that, and they would like a directory, if I understand the question correctly, and what the options are. Do I have that sort of nailed out?
Yes. Why don't we go with that?
Okay, good. So it's a loaded question, and the straight answer is it depends. All right, and it depends upon the sort of fidelity, meaning the depth of integration that is required between those Windows computing devices and a directory like LDAP, as an example. Case in chief, it's going to help with let's say, authentication and authorization needs. For example, the identity is authenticated and they are authorized to do something against a specific group, right? All that's good, but in terms of the sophistication that a computer like a Windows machine needs in terms of signing in and getting access to resources and or being able to have that device remotely managed, LDAP is not going to provide for you. So that would be, in both those camps, the things that would negate let's say, an LDAP from really being the provider, the identity provider behind a Windows machine, both a directory as a service, i.e. a jump cloud, or an Active Directory is going to assist way more deeply for those employee needs and those security needs. So long-winded way of saying it really depends, and especially if your organization is considering kind of a hybrid environment. Perhaps your team wants to use Windows, but you have a team of marketers that really, or designers for that matter, that really love Mac, and they have Adobe Creative Suite on the machines, which is really tuned for Mac computing devices. It's going to be tough to do with Active Directory. So you start to think about what's a universal directory that can manage all those machines, and a company like JumpCloud can help there.
Great. Next question is from Zaid, and he wants to know what can be done to implement it on a startup, say less than 10 employees. Something, a cheap in cost solution, but not cheap in functionality.
So first and foremost, without I don't need the attendees rolling their eyes, but quite honestly, the JumpCloud solution was built for a startup of 0 to 10 employees through thousands of employees, meaning classic small to medium, larger small to medium enterprise businesses. In our case, we advertised and built the version of our product that has 10 users for free, because we wanted to have startups not sort of throw out the concept of using a good, strong directory with a lot of phenomenal features, but not be charged the price tag that an enterprise would have to pay for it. So it does exist. We do position our product that way, but that's how I answer that without getting too.
No problem. I'll take the next question, Greg. Someone wants to know what is SaaS, and even I can answer that one for you, Jason. SaaS stands for Software as a Service. Basically, it's the way Salesforce, JumpCloud, many solutions are sold today, where you don't invest in the infrastructure per se. or licensing fees, and you kind of use the software as a service, or maybe directory as a service on a month-by-month basis. And so it's less money up front, and generally it becomes someone else's problem to handle, and you just rent the solution.
That's
And
right.
it's sort of the dominant way that we're seeing software, and especially via cloud, being delivered today. Someone else wanted to know, Tristan Johnson. Greg, quickly, best practices for managing freelance web developers' access without the use of a directory service.
So tough problem. Number one, I should say tough problem without a directory, and an even further tough problem if you forget to disable access to those folks. Let me talk to the without a directory scenario. You will have to manage some ancillary process, and by ancillary I mean probably driven from spreadsheets or reminders of some sort that the contractor, will have access to said infrastructure up to a certain date time period. Again, totally analog, not sort of automated, but you have to put sort of measures and checkpoints in place like that. Products like, in fact, Jump Cloud can provide temporal access to end users, to infrastructure, meaning you onboard an employee or a contractor, which, and again, site is correct, this is the most common use case, and you literally will say this identity will have access to the resources I provided and will shrivel up and be disabled on a given date and time. And that's a strong way to really automate and ensure that even if you forget, the system won't forget. And the system, it's better to have that access shut down and say, and the contractor nag you to say, hey, I can't get access to that web server farm anymore. What's up? Oh, okay, you were supposed to be done by now. So that's the way I would answer it. I would always err on the side of automation before anything else.
Yep. Another question, Greg, is more of a statement from Stavros, who says, I used to have an LDAP about 10 years ago while I was working at an international IT company, but not in the smaller company they're in now. And
Right.
before you answer that, Greg, I want to put that in context with the follow-up from Vino, who spoke to us about Active Directory versus LDAP. And he says, to be more specific, we don't see much Windows out here at all. More than 50% of the users use Mac. A large portion of the servers are Linux-based, and Active Directory does not fit unless one is a Windows shop. But the rest of us, the majority of the small startups, smaller companies, etc., why Active Directory? And of course, Greg, from what I know in working with you and the Jump Cloud folks in the past, is that really is part of the big reason why Jump Cloud exists, right? Why Active Directory? There really isn't a reason if you're not a predominantly Windows shop. However, like the first person said, you may not be big enough to go through the expense and everything of having your own LDAP in place. Sounds like a great solution for LDAP as a service.
It is. Let me sort of just put a blanket statement out there. Microsoft in the Active Directory product has been and is phenomenal. It's taught the industry so much good practice, meaning centralization of identity, the cadence and the methodology of onboarding, at least digitally speaking, an employee's identity, all that is good. And Microsoft will continue to ensure that they make this part of their sort of product line even more robust as they move into Azure cloud computing. But it's at the expense of non-Microsoft infrastructure, Linux, cloud-hosted environments, MacBooks, and so on, right? And that's fine. The world needs to evolve, and it is evolving. I haven't worked at an organization that has had Active Directory or virtually any Windows machines in at least 7 years, being heavily involved in startups. to the person's question about, the sort of, the MacBooks and all that kind of stuff, and we're small. Here's the real answer. The real answer is when you build a new company, right? Let's say, and you're 20, 30 employees, and you're sort of gaining revenue and or onboarding new venture capital or whatever. I guarantee you, you are not isolating or targeting a resource in IT that can manage an LDAP server. And I promise you, these are non-trivial pieces of software to stand up, A, B, scale, and C, keep alive, up and running all the time. Those expertise out there who have done LDAP and done it right are not a dying breed as much as a hyper-specialized breed who aren't interested in like utilizing LDAP for sort of the corporate needs. They're tuning it for sort of product needs, running the back end of SaaS applications, as I mentioned before. So even the expertise to manage a corporate LDAP is just a non-starter for many small companies. They are not going to target a person who knows how to do that. They're going to get a generalist. And even these modern generalists they may have used Active Directory in their past, but they're probably more in tune with rapidly deploying like SSO solutions, which are a thin layer above real directories. But still, you see my point. It's the people you need to really think about to hire and manage that IT infrastructure. And yeah, I'm riffing a bit, but it does come down to a dying breed of expertise.
Yep. All right, and the next question is one after my own heart. Robert Wesley says, I'm a CEO, not a CTO. That makes two of us. Just founded a new startup and I'm hiring. What are the time commitments for setting up a directory such as JumpCloud? I assume you mean directory as a service. Greg?
It's as fast as you can go to the sign-up form and sign up, and bam, you're in the product. Now let me untrivialize that. So first and foremost, you strip away all of the necessity to get a server like a Windows Server 2012, flip on all the bits and pay for the licensing modules for Active Directory, set up the domain controllers, build out the forests. This is just this incredible set of things you need to do to stand up a directory. LDAP is even worse. None of that you need to do out of box. Again, that's the SaaS in directory as a service. So minutes. The most complicated thing that you will need to be done, and I'm sort of setting myself up to prove that is not complicated, is to put agents on machines. They're tiny, lightweight agents, and it gives you the capability to remotely manage and control endpoints like your employees' MacBooks. So your IT guy can basically get into a machine anywhere it is around planet Earth. So it literally takes minutes, but any of our folks can spend time with you on the phone like that. We should sort of make sure that that occurs.
Okay. You know what? I think that might be the end of our questions. But there were some great ones, so thank you, everyone. And Greg, thank you and the folks at JumpCloud for sponsoring today's webinar and giving us some great information on onboarding and maybe more importantly, offboarding employees. This is an issue that, I'm sure we'll read some story again this year about some ex-employee who wasn't taken off the system, still had access to something or other, and bad things happen as a result. So good information in there for us. To those of you who have stayed on here till the end, thank you very much. Greg, do we have some information on the ebook? We're just going to mail it to everyone who registered or attended, or
we absolutely will. Yes, we do. We have a whole ebook that will be distributed to you. Our marketing team has your contact information. So everyone who has sat through will get a copy of this. It's, I don't know how many pages deep, but it's 20 or 30 pages of just voluminous info on considerations and checklists on what you need to really think about when bringing on or letting go of an employee.
Sounds great. You know what? Put me down for one too, Greg.
You got it. I think I know where
Okay.
you live.
Okay. Well, that's going to make a wrap. Call it a wrap on our first webinar of 2016. Thank you, everyone. And again, thanks to Jump Cloud and Greg for participating today. And we hope to see you soon at another DevOps.com webinar. This is Alan Schimmel, Editor-in-Chief of DevOps.com, and have a great day.
Cheers. Thanks.